Good afternoon, everyone. Could I ask you to take your places, please? Thank you. May I begin by introducing myself? I am Brigid Laffan, Director of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute. It was my pleasure to welcome the World Trade Forum here in September 2016. And at the time, there was a lot of discussion about stress in the international trading system. But the worst had yet to happen, the worst had yet to come. So I suspect that your discussions this time, given the election of an American president on an America First ticket, will be much more interesting because the issues and stresses in the international trading system and global governance more generally are much more acute today than they were even in September 2016. And I wonder, of those sitting round the room the last time in September 2016, how many of us thought that Trump could be elected or would be elected. And so I go back to Bill Clinton's quip, it's the economy stupid. Well, today it's politics stupid. And on that basis, I'm going to hand over to Joe Francois, who's from the World Trade Institute, to welcome you on behalf of his institution. May I say that the European University Institute is delighted to partner with the World Trade Institute because we're a very small institution. We have very few people working on any of the topics that we pursue, and our networks are the lifeblood of the EUI. So we're delighted to partner with the World Trade Institute. So I hand over immediately to Joe.
Thank you. So welcome. This is the fourth World Trade Forum where we've worked with EUI, and I think this has worked very well as a platform and as a model. It is, as was just noted, things are different than they were 4 years ago, right? Trade was interesting for different reasons, I think, than it is now. I think it was interesting for better reasons than it is at the moment. Also, the trade sustainability meant a different thing. I'm worrying now about the sustainability of the multilateral system, and not just how the system itself impacts sustainability. And again, I wish that was not something we're now worrying about, but we are. And so I'm certain this will come up throughout the next day and a half. So not just what's happening in terms of the impact of the trading system on sustainability and development, but also the developments and sustainability of the system itself, which is something I think genuinely we need to be worrying about. And with that, since we agreed that we just sort of say hi and then get this thing started, I'll kick over to Bernard. So.
Thanks. So let me also add my welcome to all of you, and thank you for coming, for the interest. I think this is going to be an interesting next day and a half. As many of you know, this conference is really trying to bring research to policy and vice versa, so researchers can actually hear about what is in the minds of some of the people who are closer to the policy world than we are. And that's reflected in the themes that we're going to be discussing in the conference. Brigid mentioned this is very much a partnership-driven initiative, so the partnership with WTI is very important to us, but there's lots of other partners in the room, and you'll see that reflected on the program. So we've had support from the Asian Development Bank Institute, who are here, whom I'd like to thank for actually helping to fund this. The same applies to the Bertelsmann Stiftung, which we've been working on trying to come up with ideas to save the WTO, and a number of the board members that were involved in that effort are here today, and that will be a session, plenary session tomorrow. We also have the ITC, we have UNCTAD, so these are all organizations that we've been working with, and it's not just an issue of talking. All of these partnerships have generated a lot of output, and that output will be presented in the next day and a half. So I'm very grateful for that. I think it's been a model that's working very well. There is a book session that you'll see on the program where people will be presenting initial thoughts on papers that are going to be put together in a book. The World Trade Forum has, for a long time now, generated a conference volume every year, so that will also be the case this year. So we also have a lot of academic authors who are thinking about issues relating to trade development, sustainability, presenting. So just a few logistical housekeeping remarks. The plenary sessions are going to be live streamed, which means, and this is, I guess, not going to be much of a constraint, is that speakers should be using the microphone. Of course, if they don't use the microphone, you're not going to hear anything either, so that's one. But just to know that the plenaries are going to be filmed and live streamed. Also, the speakers have badges in their bags. So I see most people have actually found their badges, but have a look in your bag. If there is a badge, you can use it so that people know who you are. And then finally, I want to end with something which usually we do at the end when nobody's around to listen. So I want to thank just a few people for putting all this together. Many of you will have dealt with Monique Cavallari, who is the lady in the conference unit of the Robert Schuman Center, who has done an amazing job in terms of making all this happen. So I really want to thank her. And then there's two people who will be floating around and will be bothering some of you for interviews and will be asking you to say good things about what's going on here. Of course, I'm not trying to influence you in any way at all. So Martina and Matthew, who is standing there doing the filming, will be wandering around with the camera over the course of the next day and a half. So he's legit. He's not working for Fox News. So all is good. So let's start then with the program, and I think the panelists should come up here. Alan Beattie, who is going to be moderating that session, will come up here, and then off we go.
Sorry? Oh, sure. Oh, sure.
Can I just, the acoustics in this room? You just can't, it's these old monasteries.
I know.
They're beautiful, but
They weren't built for doing this.
well, they were built.
Introduction. I'm Alan Beattie. I'm an editorial writer at the Financial Times, currently based in Brussels. As you've heard, a lot of you will remember when trade was a rather niche subject. I remember when it was quite a boring news story. And I spent 5 years as world trade editor at the FT, and whenever I approached the news desk, all enthusiastic about a news story, eyebrows would be raised, and someone would say, "Don't tell me, Alan, the Doha round's collapsed again." As Brigid says, we can thank Donald Trump for at least one thing, which is to make trade more interesting again. But of course, the threat to trade, the threat to global governance, the threat to the trading system goes beyond Trump, and it goes to a general rejection of the way things are done and a general wave of populism, at least across the developed world. And that's provided, I think, the biggest test of the global trading system since certainly the collapse of Bretton Woods in the early 1970s, probably since the Second World War. So how should governments respond? Is there life in multilateralism? Do we need to find different ways? To discuss that, we have Brigid Laffan, who you've already heard from, who's director of the Schuman Center here at the EUI, Paola Conconi, from the professor at the Free University of Brussels, Caroline Freund from the World Bank, and our token man on the panel is Lúcio Souza from the European Political Strategy Center. The format of this is that we will have maybe 15 minutes or so, 10-15 minutes from each from each of the speakers, and then we will open it up to discussion and questions. Brigid.
So good afternoon, everyone. I must begin with a caveat. I'm not a trade specialist and I haven't worked on trade, so what I will talk about is politics, because that is something I claim to know something about. When thinking about a phenomenon called backlash, backlash comes in many forms. It can simply be an episodic reaction, it can involve counterattack, or also outright hostility. And a backlash against globalization is not something new. There were articles being written from the end of the 1990s onwards on a supposed backlash against globalization. And for me, thinking back over the years, I would have thought Seattle 99 was an important turning point in that you had significant protest, involvement of a police crackdown, and a lot of divergence within the WTO itself. But where did the protests come from back then? It came from traditional social movements of the left. It came predominantly from human rights activists, environmental groups, labor movement activists. Yes, there were some on the right from a protectionist point of view, but the phenomenon was a phenomenon largely of the left. So a question to all of you is, has the form of the backlash changed? I would argue yes. And has its intensity altered? So what has changed in that intervening period? I would say, firstly, as interdependence has deepened and most of the world has become part of the world economy, there have been significant public opinion shifts in some countries. In other words, it's not just a social movement phenomenon, but a wider societal phenomenon. Secondly, we have experienced the 2007-8 onwards global financial crisis, and that put enormous stress on the economies of many parts of the world. Interestingly, the policy reaction was not closure, which meant that a great recession did not become a Great Depression, but the legacy and political consequences of the global financial crisis are still being felt, particularly across the democratic world. When thinking about the multilateral system and global governance, we might think in terms of the disjuncture between what I might call the demand for global governance on the one hand and the capacity to supply on the other. There's no doubt that if you look at transboundary challenges, the connectedness of the world we live in, its truly global form, then as we approach the third decade of the 21st century, no one could argue that there isn't a pressing need for global governance. The problem, in my view, is on the supply side, and that's increasingly influenced by what is happening in domestic politics. In other words, it's the transmission of what is happening within domestic politics to the world at large that we need to pay particular attention to. So what I'd like to do now is sketch for you, and it is a sketch, and it's obviously not as nuanced as it should be, what is happening in domestic politics. Firstly, I would argue that the infrastructure of politics has weakened. What do I mean by this? The classical transmission belts of politics, political parties, and the way they form party systems is being profoundly altered. The traditional transmission belts of trade unions have greatly weakened, so those large societal organizations that aggregated interests are now much weaker. As a consequence, what we have is a fragmentation of the political marketplace. I, as a student of political science, used to write essays on the frozen party systems. The frozen party systems are no more. In fact, the actual survival of party systems as we would have understood is at stake. So the political marketplace is very, very fragmented. For example, in the Netherlands, there are now up to 20 different political parties competing for votes. Also, traditional political parties, the squeezed middle, they really are being squeezed. Across Europe, between 2004 and 2012, the proportion of votes going to what we would classically call challenger parties went from 10% to about 24%, with variations across states. But something is happening the center of politics. Another important observation is that historically, the barriers to political entry, to political competition, were actually quite high. It was not easy to form new political parties. It was not easy to compete in the marketplace for votes. It is very different now. And the example I would give you is Macron's En Marche. Historically, he would not have become French president. He could not have mounted the kind of campaign that he mounted without a political infrastructure. But he, En Marche, a movement, using coalitions of the willing and the available, was able to win the highest office in France. So we need to think very carefully about what's happening, the infrastructure of politics and the political marketplace. Moving then to the behavioral side of politics, to how individuals are behaving politically, then what we certainly know is there's much greater volatility than before, that elections have much larger swings, and in fact some parties have actually disappeared from the marketplace than one would have ever predicted even 10 years ago. Being in government should carry a health warning for a political party or politicians, because kicking the incumbents out was a distinctive phenomenon of the crisis. And what we have to think about is not just the initial round of elections in the crisis between 8, 9, 10 and 11, but we're now seeing the second round of post-crisis elections, and that volatility is still there. Then political communication has been absolutely transformed. It is no longer the case that the traditional media outlets are the only conduit to the marketplace, to individual voters. It is a very, again, fragmented space with multiple ways of getting to those to voters. And of course, we also know that there is serious political manipulation from outside. That's a very new phenomenon. Well, I should say it's not an entirely new phenomenon. One should not forget what the CIA attempted to do in this country in 1948 in terms of the communists. But it was really not possible to attack a democratic system, a voting system as it is now. Then we have more referendums, and referendums are distinct political events. They distill very complex issues into yes and no, leave and remain, and they are beloved of the radical right, and particularly the radical right populists, because again, if you can get a referendum, you can actually lead to quite extraordinary outcomes, given what might be seen to be rational. So what's the consequence of all this? Firstly, government formation is becoming much more difficult. It's taking longer, and coalition building is much more difficult. Secondly, if one looks at who's gained politically from the crisis, from the economic crisis, it's been predominantly the radical right. Yes, there's also been radical left success, but it's the radical right. They've got more votes and they're more successful. They've managed to shift the agenda, and shift the agenda in terms of national closure. There are also illiberal authoritarians at the table. I simply point to what's happening in the eastern half of the continent, Poland and Hungary, but I don't think Romania and Bulgaria are very far behind. So what does this mean for the subject that you're looking at, impact of new politics on trade governance? I would distinguish between what politics in the US and the United Kingdom, their impact, and the rest of Europe. So firstly, US and Trump. Trump, clearly America first. He ran on an anti-trade ticket, an anti-globalization ticket, an American first ticket. In other words, he ran a pretty classical economic nationalism ticket. And it did have societal underpinnings, particularly the industrial Midwest, but he resonated with a section of the US electorate and the distributional consequences of globalization. And he has decided, as president, to directly attack the trading system in two ways, in terms of what's known as the so-called trade war, but also in terms of the institutions, the appellate body, the WTO. Brexit equally is, but of course, globally not as significant. But Brexit was a mixture of economic nationalism under the guise of global Britain. In other words, that the United Kingdom would loosen the ties that bind it to Europe and suddenly emerge newly made as global Britain. Brexit was a lot about identity politics and migration, but it is a living experiment on just how difficult it is for any advanced country to untie the links, the deep interdependence that characterizes the world we live in. And just as Alan said, that trade was one time might be seen as boring, well, I suspect that there are many people in the United Kingdom know a lot more about supply chains now than they ever needed to know in their lives. But supply chains clearly matter, and they are people's jobs. And so I think what's happened in both these countries, of course the United States as the linchpin of that global order, what Trump can do to the multilateral system is more serious than what the United Kingdom can do. But both in a way are, in a sense, playing with the multilateral system. So then I turn to Europe and the rest of the EU. In Europe, trade is not there are, of course, protectionist forces, but trade has not become politicized. Migration is what is driving the radical right in Europe. Free movement of EU nationals is largely accepted, provided that there are rules in place on things like the Posted Workers Directive. But what's interesting, that the single market was not questioned during the acute phase of the crisis. In other words, Europe has learnt the value, at least continental Europe, and I would add that smaller island to the west of the United Kingdom, have learnt the benefits of deep interdependence. So I think there's an interesting difference between what is happening in Europe, and I'm not a specialist on Asia, so I'm not talking about Asia, and what's the US-UK dimension. So what are the consequences of all of this? I would say as the US moves away from economic integration and multilateralism, the rest of the world is adjusting and will adjust. And clearly there will be a premium on regionalism, that will be an attempt both to save the regional and then strengthen the interregional is a likely consequence of all of this, and I see what the EU is doing in response both to Trump and Brexit. It really is trying to hoover up as many strategic partnerships like the one with Japan, the CETA with Canada. In other words, to strengthen bilateral trade deals in one way or another. And of course, that means that we're likely to see a faster onset of a multipolar world. The question is, how does a multipolar world, which is more regional and more fragmented, how does it handle the global oversight and the need for global governance? In other words, also adjudication systems, arbitration systems, and all of that. How compatible is intensive regionalism with the WTO? Again, that's not something I can talk about. And then I think in terms of domestic politics, the drivers, the social and economic consequences of deep interdependence have got to be addressed across the world, and addressed at a time of rapidly technological change, because there's a tendency sometimes to think the problem is trade when in fact it's technology, or the challenge is trade when in fact it's technology. And then there needs to be a serious look at how to tax mobile capital, because the only way you can mitigate the domestic consequences of deep interdependence is to have buffers. And that does rely on the tax capacity of individual states, which are not helped by the capacity of capital to move to the extent that it can and avoid tax. So I leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Brigid. Very interesting indeed to hear about the domestic aspect of it. A very wise person once said to me when I started to cover this stuff, you must always, always remember that globalization begins at home. And now Paola.
Let's see. So I have slides, and I'm going to talk about political economy. So we start politics, political economy. Okay, so let me, and can I have, maybe I can use this mic, I don't like to sit. View full screen. So I'm going to do something slightly different. Starting, I have little time, so I'll squeeze a few ideas about a project some of you have seen in detail. I'm still working on this. That is actually not about the backlash of globalization, but rather the forces of globalization. I'll have something to say about the backlash at the end in the last few slides, as Bernard asked me. So let me also get these. Let's see if it works. No, it doesn't. The microphone, does it work? No, the only thing that doesn't work is my clicker, because there is no... Are the biggest players. So if you look at the data on lobbying expenditures, which is what we do also in this page, in this project, you see that industry associations spend very little money. And the big players, when it comes to lobbying on trade agreements, are big firms. And also the focus of the traditional literature on industry is at odds with the literature on firm heterogeneity in trade, which tells you that even within narrowly defined industries, firms will have very different interests. Some will be exporting, importing inputs, some will be domestic. So their trade policy preferences should be very different. So what we do in this project is study theoretically and empirically, actually first empirically, starting from the data and then building a model, lobbying on trade agreements by heterogeneous firms. And as I said, we start from the data, and we collected all lobbying expenditures by firms, and we also have information on lobbying by trade unions and industry associations, but I'm not going to talk about it in this project or today. But basically, we have collected all lobbying reports filed by firms since the Lobbying Disclosure Act in the United States was passed in '95, and every quarter a firm that is lobbying on anything has to report its lobbying expenditures. Not only that, but also on what it is lobbying. So we collected all these reports that tell us how much each firm is spending on each trade agreement in each quarter, and whether the firm is in favor or against. And with this data, we find out, we uncover quite a few striking facts. The first one that I put in bold is the most striking one, that is, in virtually all cases, 99.25% of the cases to be precise, we see that the firms that lobby on trade agreements lobby in favor. And then the other findings that you see just straight from the data are maybe not as striking. You see that there is clearly selection into lobbying. You have the lobbying firms are clearly larger than non-lobbying firms, and they're more likely to be engaged in trade, both on the export and import side. So then we go to, if you take these facts, they are sort of not rationalizable with the models that you can take off the shelf that we have been teaching, because the models we have been teaching on political economy or trade agreements have no firms. So what we do is develop a new model of political economy or trade agreements with heterogeneous firms, in which firms choose whether and how much to lobby in favor or against a proposed free trade agreement. And then we go back to the data, because this model delivers a precise prediction about the intensive margin of lobbying, that is, how much a firm would spend on a particular agreement. And I'll try to tell you a bit about those results. I'm going to skip the related literature and go straight to describing the data we collected. So as I mentioned, we use data on lobbying expenditures, This is the kind of data that has been used in more recent studies of empirical political economy. So the old studies were using data on campaign contributions, like the Goldberg, Maggi, etc., because at the time there was no data on lobbying expenditures. But the data on lobbying expenditure is particularly interesting. There are two main advantages. The first is that you can really look at what firms who are paying are, what is the target of their lobbying. As you'll see in a few slides, a particular firm, say Philip Morris, will say, I'm lobbying, I'm spending $2 million in favor of the Colombia-US Free Trade Agreement. If you instead pay money for the campaign of a particular, say, senator, you don't know what policy you're trying to influence. So there is the issue targeted that you can identify, but also lobbying expenditure is by far the biggest channel through which firms lobby. Here is a picture that from the mid-90s tells you, in red you have lobbying expenditures and in blue you have the campaign contribution. You can see that overall lobbying expenditure is more than 10 times PAC contributions. So what we did is collected all lobbying reports that were filed by firms and related to trade agreements that have been ratified in the US Congress, or this is our main database. We have an extended database that I don't have the time to discuss, but these are all the trade agreements that have been negotiated by the United States since the mid-90s. Unfortunately, we cannot go back because the Lobbying Disclosure Act was passed in 95, so you cannot have the data on the Canada-US or the NAFTA agreement, but post-95 you have all the data. And so this, each report tells you, let me give you an example. This is very small, but basically this will be what a report looks like from 2008, where they are in digital format. Pre-2008, they are not digitalized, so you have to go through them manually. But they basically have information on the identity of the firm. Here is Philip Morris, the example I was mentioning before. It tells you, the address, etc., and how much it is spending. In this case, it is in the third quarter of 2008. It is spending just over $1 million. And in section 15 and 16 of the lobbying report, you always have the issues of the lobbying. So section 15 of the lobbying report tells you the general issue, which for us, since we are interested in lobbying on trade agreements, is trade, TRD. And section 16 is the specific issue. So here you see that the specific issue in this report is the House resolution and Senate resolution that correspond to the United States Colombia Trade Promotion Act, and the firm is lobbying in favor of its full implementation. So this is the type of report we collected. It tells you which firm lobbied when, on what agreement, and how much is spent in favor or against. So we match this lobbying data set with CompuStat, which gives you additional information on the lobbying firms. So for example, how big it is in terms of sales or employment, and what are the main activities. It's NACE code, is it a firm in steel, is it a firm in the car industry? So we got additional information, and through this information we can also match it with the relevant tariffs. So for example, if you're looking at a US company that is in soybean production, its activity is soybean, then you can look at, for example, how much does this company has to gain from the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement. If you look at then the tariffs that existed pre-US Korea, US KORUS, soybean tariffs in Korea were 500%. So this is a company that when you look at a specific trade agreement had to gain a lot because its tariff on its final good went from 500% to 0. So you can look at the relevant tariffs, and we collected all the data on the relevant tariffs, both on the export side. These are the tariffs on the final good that the firm is producing, and the tariffs it faces when it exports its final good to trading partners. But the other tariffs that matter are tariffs on the input. If you are a car manufacturer, we can identify with input-output tables what are the inputs that are relevant to you, and we can look at the input tariffs that you face pre-agreement that would be eliminated by the FTA. So basically, firms in principle can gain from an FTA through two channels. One is a reduction of the tariffs they face on the final good, and the other one is elimination of the tariffs they face on the imported intermediates. So we collected all this data, and then with this data, as I mentioned, we uncover a few facts. And the main fact that I think is striking is what I was mentioning before. If you look at the percentage of firms that are in a lobbying data set that lobby in favor of trade agreements is 99.25. In our main data set, we do various robustness, and it always stays above 98%. We basically observe only 2 firms in our main data set that ever lobbied against, and these are 2 textile firms that lobbied against US, Korea, but the same firms lobbied in favor of other agreements like Colombia or Panama. So if there's no firm that always lobbied against. So there is this very strong, instead of backlash, so when you were saying earlier, it's politics, the economics, clearly the large firms have been pushing for liberalization. And to some extent they've succeeded. I mean, they've been paying a lot of money to push through these agreements, and these agreements have been negotiated, and more or less all of them ratified, although we have had agreements like TTIP and TPP who have been blocked recently. Nevertheless, so what do we do? Okay, let me show you a few other pictures just about the facts. As I mentioned, the selection into lobbying, I mean, the lobbying firms are larger. This is like the distribution of sales, or this is sales and this is employment. You clearly see that the lobbying firms are larger, and you can see it econometrically. Let me skip that. You can also see, if you run a regression with the probability of lobbying and how it depends on whether the firm is exporting or importing, you see that participating in international trade, no surprise there, increases the probability of lobbying on trade agreements. Okay, so I'm going to skip the model. I just want to tell you the key ingredients. So if you take the existing models like Grossman-Helpan, the workers model in the political economy literature, you cannot explain the facts I just presented because there are no firms, there are only industries. Not only that, but lobbying in Grossman-Helpan is exogenous. There's no choice of lobbying or no lobbying. It's simply assumed that some industries are organized and others are not. Plus, and that's also important, in the traditional model, the money is paid ex post. So in the Grossman-Helpan model, I promise you some money, then you deliver the policy, and then I pay you. What you see in reality with all this lobbying data we have been collecting is that firms pay before the policy outcome is realized. So you pay before Congress is ratifying. All this data is, the outcome is not realized. So you're paying ex ante. So you need a model with these features, firms that are heterogeneous, that choose, endogenous choose how much to lobby, and lobbying is done ex ante. And that's what we do. So these are the key. I'm going to skip, of course, the model, but we have the key features are that in terms of political structures, that there is lobbying ex ante. So we use the contest success function approach, where lobbying occurs ex ante. And firms choose how much to lobby, in favor or against, and politicians may be biased in favor or against the agreement. If you think about today, there's a big bias against globalization, and this is part of our model. You have politicians may like trade liberalization or not. This is part of the politics, and firms know that there can be a bias in favor or against, but there is some uncertainty, and actually this uncertainty is key. I don't have the time to go into it, but uncertainty is actually a key ingredient in our model. And on the market structure, on the economic structure, the key feature you have to retain is that the lobbying firms are large. If you didn't have large firms, they wouldn't lobby. I mean, if you take a standard model, monopolistic competitive model with a continuous small firms, these firms will not find it rational to individually spend money, which is what you see them doing in the data. So you need a model with firms that have mass, that are large, that are granular. And that's what we have. And with this model, which I'm going to skip in the interest of time, we get additional prediction on the intensive margin of lobby, meaning how much individual firms should spend on trade agreements. Let me just show you what we find. First finding is that in line with the model's predictions, larger firms spend more on trade agreements. So if you compare within an agreement, say, firms spending on chorus, and then you compare how much various firms spend on the same agreement, you see the larger firms spend more. This is the first result. The second result is that the same firm, so this is with firm fixed effect, so I'm taking Philip Morris or whatever firm is in a lobbying data set and exploiting variation across agreements, and a given firm spends more, the more it has to gain in terms of the bigger is the reduction in its final goods tariff, or in its input tariff. So if you are the soybean producers and you add a 500%, you gain a lot on your final good. With Korea, you gain a lot. In another FTA, with another FTA partners, they were maybe lower tariff on your final good, or the US. So you get the point. So the bigger the gain in terms of tariff reduction on the export and import side, the more you spend. You spend also more with agreements with larger trading partners. And interestingly, so this is something we recently have been doing, so we use measures from the WTO on the debt. Where is Michele? So we use your measure, and we use the measure of the Bern group, the DESTA measure. And so we looked at where the firms spend also more. So again, with firm fixed effects, we're exploiting variation across agreements, and firms also spend more on agreements that are deeper. So this is again on the intensive margin. And finally, an interesting prediction that comes from our model and from the uncertainty that is in our model is that firms, the more they are uncertain about the Congress passing the agreement, the more they spend. Because if you know that the government is going to pass the agreement anyway, it's going to be ratified anyway, you're going to free ride on the politicians' bias in favor. So what the models would suggest is one of the predictions that you should spend more the more uncertain you are that the agreement will pass, and that's what you see, and I'm going to go fast. So let me just conclude saying a few things, and I'm going back to the backlash against globalization in the next slide. So this is just a summary that you don't need. One thing I wanted to point out is that these results may seem at odds with the protection for sale, the idea that, lobbying is all against, the traditional view is that efforts to liberalize are met by staunch, strong opposition by firms. What you see in our data and in our model is firms pushing, large firms that gain from globalization, from free trade agreements, pushing in favor of trade agreements. In a way, this is not so surprising. We know from the literature on firm heterogeneity that large firms gain from trade. These are the firms that selecting to exporting, selecting to import, into FDI. These are the global firms. And if you add selection into lobbying, that is the large firms that lobby, then are there in K Street and spending all this money, which is what you have in the political structure of our model, then it's no surprise that the key players are those who can, they are the winners from globalization. They like trade agreements because they reduce tariffs on their export goods, and they make it easier to source intermediate inputs from their own subsidiaries abroad or from independent suppliers. So it's actually no surprise. However, and that's an important caveat, the same firms maybe not, so they clearly are pushing for trade agreements or have been pushing for trade agreements. They've been behind these big waves, this proliferation of FTAs in the last few decades, but the kind of trade policy that you're talking about matters. If you look at the political economy of, say, anti-dumping, that's very different because, FTAs are reciprocal, first of all. So I cut my tariffs, but you, Korea, do the same. Not only they are reciprocal, but they are broad. They involve cuts across sectors. So you may suffer an increasing competition, because your own country eliminates tariff on your final good, but the other country does the same. That's reciprocity. But also you get cheaper inputs because these are broad. They cover many different sectors. If you were to look instead at specific unilateral and sector-specific trade policy, the politics would be different. This is part of a broader agenda. One of the interesting things I want to tell you, one of the things we are working on right now is moving deeper into the depth of the trade agreement. So in the direction of what you are working at the bank and other people. So we want to collect, and we started collecting, that's thousands or more reports, detailed information on the non-trade issues firms lobby with trade agreements. So this is an example of Glaxo that in whatever quarter of 2012 spent $2 million lobbying on TPP, but in particular on the intellectual property aspects. And many other firms in the pharmaceutical industry lobbying on TPP. And when you look at the TPP agreement, there are lots of provisions that seem to be extremely favorable to the drug industry. So we want to basically get detailed information both from the text of the agreement and the lobbying reports to look at the lobbying on the content of the trade agreement. And that's one of the directions. Finally, one of my students talking about shocks, you were talking about the election of Trump. This is actually, just for the fun of it, this is one of my students, Michael, who is also a co-author on this paper I was presenting. They just looked at the surprise election of Trump. All the polls were saying Hillary's going to win. And, in November 2 years ago, surprise, surprise, Trump got elected. And this is actually the shocks to the stock market returns of firms that had lobbied in favor of TPP. And the first thing Trump did was to scrap TPP, as he had promised. And you see that the returns of these firms that had bet on, that had not anticipated that Trump would get elected, and they had lobbied for TPP, clearly, this is just an event study that this student of mine did. Let me just conclude with what I promised, which now I cannot find again, sorry. It's getting there. That's a very, very last slide, which is about what you told me, Bernard. Aspect, the response. So my take is that if you look at the last few decades, firms like multinationals and large firms that are the winners from globalization have been pushing for more liberalization, for reducing trade barriers, signing more trade agreements. This is something that was favorable to them. They can expand in export markets, and they can source input from their own subsidiaries or independent suppliers, and this is good for them. This has led to the emergence of GVCs that we all are familiar with, and so there's been this push by globalized firms, but the politics is still national. You're not going to be elected, if you are Trump or whoever politician, your constituency is not a global constituency. You're accountable, and you are elected by the local guy. So if you have firms that have gone and offshore production to other countries, your FTA partners or elsewhere, these are not firms that are going to have the same political voice. So Trump, now there are many firms that are saying, well, wait a second, but we are re-importing we are producing solar panels in China, in the Philippines, in Korea. Now we are hit by the tariffs that you're imposing on us. And you say, yeah, fair enough, you should reshore, and that's what they are doing. So some of these companies are reinvesting in the US, and where they will have again a political voice, because once you're back in the domestic arena and you employ people, then politicians will listen to you and will. So I think that's something that I think the political economy model miss a bit. We have it in a reduced form in this paper, but something that, I think firms have gone global, but the politics remains very much bounded to the national, and this does create a tension. So let me just leave. I'm sorry I went a bit over, so this is it. Caroline.
I think I'll do the same as Paola,
Are we going to
because
stand
I
up
also
again?
have just a few slides. So let me. So I'm going to talk from three perspectives. One, I'm just going to say a few words about the backlash. And I do actually think, as was mentioned, that it's partly identity politics, but I'm going to talk about it from an economic and, in particular, trade perspective. And then I'm going to talk about what I think is the fundamental flaw in trade governance today, and that we would have to deal with it to move forward, and then a little bit about how we would move forward. So just to say a few words about the backlash, I think the kind of traditional story is inequality in jobs in advanced countries, that lower wages and the moving of manufacturing to developing countries led to the loss of good jobs in advanced countries, and this brought about the kind of backlash. The problem with that story is that one, technology was a big part of that, and a much bigger part than trade, technology and automation. Two, it was partly due to demand shifts, that as countries develop, they shift towards services. In addition, these same shocks were felt worldwide, and it's not the case that inequality was increasing everywhere. There are many advanced countries where inequality was actually falling over the period from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s, And finally, the timing doesn't add up. So the trade boom was from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s, and it wasn't until 2016 that we started to see this kind of backlash. I think another economic is just slowdown. When there's a slowdown, and there really was a growth slowdown for a number of years after the financial crisis, especially in the advanced countries, people get restless and they turn to both the identity type politics, but as well towards populism and protectionism, nationalism, etc. The third is the rise of China, that nobody thought China was going to grow quite as fast as it did when it joined the WTO in 2001. And this led to some insecurity in developed countries. From a PPP standpoint, China is now a bigger economy than the US. It also brought a whole bunch of new issues into the global trade system that need to be addressed that really had been a very small part. It was much more about liberalizing tariffs than it was about dealing with subsidies, investment rules, state-owned enterprises, and technology transfer. And finally, the WTO stalled. So there were high hopes for the Doha development round. It never materialized. And if you think of from Bhagwati's kind of bicycle theory, you have to keep moving or you fall over, well, we didn't really keep moving. So that's kind of another story. But let me tell you a bit about what I think the real challenge is. If you look at, from Global Trade Alert, the main so-called harmful policy instruments that have come into play in recent years, half of them are actually about export promotion. So there are subsidies excluding export promotion and export credit, including subsidies, which some countries still have type policies. So half of the policies that are considered harmful were really about promoting exports. They weren't about protectionism. And then much of the protectionism was actually a response to these export promoting policies or stuff in new areas like government procurement, et cetera. And the economic effects of subsidies and how to deal with them are difficult. So one thing we have seen is that simple prohibitions, which are in the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, simple prohibitions on export subsidies and local content requirements, although maybe not recently, have tended to work well. What hasn't worked so well is the areas where it's a lot harder to determine the permissible ones from the unpermissible ones. So, and if we think about why that's the case, it's because economists have recognized there are both negative and positive effects of subsidies. So the negative effects are, of course, the biggest one, they distort trade and investment because they pull it towards the subsidized firms and away from the most productive, and also away from countries that may have comparative advantage. They can also cause environmental problems if it happens to be an energy, coal-based or excess fishing, et cetera. And they can expand the gap between rich and poor, actually, and I think we've seen this in agriculture, where if rich countries can provide more in subsidies, they pull those industries away from what would happen in developing countries in the absence of those subsidies. But there are also reasons to have subsidies. And one is just to address any kind of market failure. So maybe without subsidies, any firm wouldn't invest enough in research and development because that can easily be taken over by or stolen by other companies, so they don't get the full rewards of that investment. They may not internalize the positive spillover of investing in renewables. Sometimes subsidies can help actually reduce inequalities if you subsidize particular areas of the country that are behind economically. And one argument and why they were never addressed heavily in the WTO in the past is because they were just considered less distortive than tariffs. In fact, from economic theory, if you subsidize an industry, you should be worsening your terms of trade, which you wouldn't really want to do. Now, if we have market power or other features, there are reasons countries may want to subsidize industries, but the worry about it wasn't as much. But I think this quote by Alan Sykes really highlights that it's very, very difficult and the rules are, as he says, just incoherent. So we haven't really addressed subsidies in the WTO. And I think this is becoming an increasing problem. So this is some work I did last year with Dario Sidhu. And what we looked at was global industrial concentration. So rather than looking at industrial concentration within a country, which we hear lots of concerns about it's risen, we're looking at an industry around the world and saying, how has the four-firm concentration ratio changed? And actually, overall, it's declined. So all these concerns about market power from a global level, it's less of a concern. And that's happened because developing country large firms are coming up and displacing the incumbents from advanced countries, and actually the concentration ratio is falling. But in several industries, what we do see is the concentration ratio rising, and they tend to be industries where there are state-owned enterprises. So where there are large state-owned enterprises, industrial concentration has increased, and that's really a concern. And if you look, this is a geographical distribution of the top four firms in each industry across countries and regions. And the really big entrant is China, which now has 136 of the top 1,000 companies in the world by revenue. And then within industries, it also dominates several industries. But of those 136 companies, 70% are state-owned. So this is something really different, as Paola was talking about. Large firms do a lot of this lobbying. They're a lot of what the trade world is about. We know that the top 1% of exporters in the US are 80% of exports. Big firms are really where trade is happening. But if some of them are state-owned or subsidized, it's gonna have repercussions around the world. And it's something that really, I think, does need to ultimately be addressed. So disciplining these subsidies is becoming critical for world trade governance. And especially when countries that are dominant in a sector, or large countries have these, can really have negative spillovers for the rest of the world. Regional agreements don't work to discipline these because it doesn't stop countries outside. So we've seen this problem in agriculture for years and years, where the European Union still has subsidies as does US. We need some kind of joint agreement. And they can lead to spiraling protectionism as the excess capacity makes its way into global markets. So how do we move forward? There's a nice paper by Gary Horlick and I can't remember, Clark, and they describe some ways, some things that are important in order to move forward. And I think one is just better data. So the WTO requires notification of subsidies, but this chart here shows that as of now, nearly half of countries don't report at all. So just a much better notification process. We need more evidence to make informed policy decisions. And right now, I don't think we have a very good sense of how distortive, or maybe not distortive, subsidies are. And to expand the agreement in terms of the prohibited list, and maybe have a negative list instead, so that you can only identify certain sectors where you'll still have some, maybe renewables and such. And then expand the agreement to agriculture, where we know subsidies have caused tremendous harm, especially to the poorest countries. And services, where it's starting to be a really big issue. So if you look at the largest construction companies in the world, the 4 largest construction companies in the world are all state-owned. And if we're thinking about big infrastructure projects being built, this can distort that market. And now lastly, this is my last slide, just to conclude on the idea of moving forward. We have a joint paper, the World Bank, the WTO, and the IMF, which is going to be released on Sunday, about reinvigorating trade and inclusive growth. And in this paper, what we do is we think about some ways the WTO could actually work to also just keep moving forward. And right now, there are some of these joint initiatives around different areas, whether it's services, regulatory cooperation, electronic commerce, investment, market access, medium and small enterprises, and gender. I think these are ways of showing that the WTO can still work. And while it's nice to do the big single undertaking over many topics, it may be that in the current trade environment, it's easier to do single issue agreements and open initiatives, but it may be impossible to do something that involves everybody. But as long as it's open, then other countries can join. So anyway, that paper will be coming out on Sunday, and thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
Many thanks to all of
Lúcio,
you.
thank you.
As you probably realize, that I am the policymaker on the panel, as the one that's wearing a tie. Now, doing my intervention just after Caroline, you are going to see that there is a significant convergence of messages between what she has on her PowerPoint and what I would have had on my theoretical PowerPoint if I had been told that this is allowed here. But we, the Commission, we like to play by the rules, so we assume that everybody does. Now, I am the head of the economics department of the internal think tank that advises the President of the European Commission. So what I'm going to be doing here is to frame this discussion in terms of what have been our actions to deal with perceived and concrete threats to the global multilateral trade framework. And you are going to see that, not coincidentally, there is a very significant degree of convergence between both the analysis of the situation that Caroline has just presented and the alternatives that we see for moving forward. Now, as a background on that, the Commission, after receiving a formal mandate from the European Council on 29 of June of this year, was entasked with the mission of proposing a set of reforms for development of the global multilateral trade framework, namely the World Trade Organization. The reasons why we thought it was necessary to reinvigorate the global trading framework are very well encapsulated on what Caroline just described as the beginning. The way that we see the process having evolved is not linked to a particular single political event, but something that has been evolving for the past 20 years, and therefore reflects a macro trend in terms of technological and economic shifts on a global scale. All of us that have worked with trade-related matters knows that we have been blocked in terms of negotiations on the Doha round for effectively the past 20 years. The underlying reason for that is that after the beginning of the 2000s, the composition of forces and interests on the WTO with a much enlarged membership became significantly different from what we had in the old GATT. This reflects obvious changes in terms of global economic power of different blocs and technological shocks more broadly defined. The practical implication of that is that in terms of renewed rulemaking, the WTO has effectively, to a large extent, stopped evolving. We all know how extremely difficult it is nowadays to make the WTO evolve as an organization. So the way that we try to approach the situation, given that obviously we have a situation in which we benefit strongly from trade as the European Union, as do everybody else around planet Earth, this is an area which is welfare improving globally and therefore should be preserved. The nature of the proposals that we put out, which I forwarded to Bernie, who of course made available for everybody here, so you can all read it later, so I'm going to concentrate very briefly in only one of the blocks of the proposals that we put on the table. We received the mandate on the 28-29. We worked very hard during the summer. After all, we are making the money that you pay to the European taxpayer and that comes to us be used in an effective fashion. So on the 18th of September, we had this on the table. The block of proposals is organized around three main areas. One is the main initial one, which is to unlock the future rulemaking capabilities of the WTO. We have a second block, which is related to make the WTO more operational in terms of ongoing activities. And the third one, which is rather legalistic but not unimportant, is the unblocking of the settlement system. This is a very specific legal question but has important implications for the short-term sustainability of the WTO as an enforcement mechanism. In practical terms, if we are into a situation in which we have 3 or less appellate judges by the spring of next year, the WTO will effectively stop being able to perform this important part of its functions. But I'm not going to mention that, among other reasons, because of the time constraints, so I will concentrate myself on the first part of our policy proposals, which again are extremely consistent with what Caroline just presented to us. Effectively, given what I just described to you, the underlying problem as we see it of the global multilateral trading system is not a particular punctual political question, but a mega trend that we have observed in the past 20 years. This has significant implications in terms of the rulemaking and rule enforcement of the WTO. Let's start with the area of subsides, which was so eloquently demonstrated by Caroline here. We have observed a situation in which not only the process of reporting of subsides which are prohibited and or actionable has actually stagnated among member states or member countries in this particular case, or the WTO, but that the footprint of subsides which are not adequately captured by the existing institutional framework of the WTO has increased. In other terms, we have problems both in terms of the enforcement of the existing capabilities of the WTO and problems in terms of the enforcement related to new areas of subsides which were not adequately captured on the initial institutional framework of the WTO. So the first part of our proposals deals with this enhancement of the footprint of the WTO in terms of the capture and enforcement on subsides in new areas, but also in terms of the enforcement of the WTO capabilities in acting on traditional areas in which you have notifications of existing subsides. An important related component to it, which was again eloquently demonstrated by Caroline, is that the nature of some of those subsides is linked to a particular institutional form, namely state-owned enterprises. We do have a concept in terms of the WTO structure that enables you to deal with state-owned enterprises per se, which is the notion of public body. But what we have increasingly observed is not the question of the state-owned enterprise per se, and its relation to a sovereign, to a government, which is what is effectively captured on the WTO rules that we currently have, but the usage of the state-owned enterprise or body as a provider of subsidies in one dimension or another, and therefore having a market distorted effect. So this is also part of the changes that we are proposing. A better capture of state-owned enterprises, a enforcement of the current subside frameworks that exist on the WTO, and an enlargement of the footprint of subsides which should be covered by WTO disciplines. Now, as I indicated, the underlying perception of why we are in the situation that we are now is because of a geopolitical change related to some technological change. Another part of our proposals tries to address that by first covering areas which were virtually non-existent in the beginning of the WTO, namely e-trade and e-commerce, which are areas which are cross-cutting in several economic activities and which are effectively protected to a large degree by specific WTO partners. Related to that, we are observing certain types of actions, forced technology transfers, the discriminatory nature or strategic nature in relation to usage of foreign direct investment, which we feel are inadequately represented in both the GATS and TRIMS frameworks as they currently exist. So another part of our proposals is the change of the rulemaking capabilities of the WTO to address some of those behind-the-border questions related to forced technology transfers, foreign direct investment, and how to address the new questions brought about by e-commerce. A separate block of our proposals is related to, let's call it this way, the particular legal situation in which less developed countries, or in some cases allegedly less developed countries, are currently treated by WTO legal frameworks. You certainly are aware that currently roughly 2/3 of the membership of the WTO have effectively sweeping blocking exemptions from several of the WTO disciplines. We don't question at all the notion that truly deserving developing countries should benefit from some sort of exemption or protection. We do object to a certain narrative that sometimes we perceive as seeing trade as something that is inimical to development. As we all that have been working on the developing economics space know, trade is a powerful force for development. In some cases, certain types of safeguards are clearly and necessarily deserved, but that's not a blanket extension. Now, we have come to a situation in which, as I just indicated, 2/3 of the current membership of the WTO effectively have sweeping block exemptions from the disciplines of the WTO. That includes countries that are some of the major trading powers globally today, and include countries that, in terms of the level of GDP per capita, and you don't even need to use a PPP measurement to get to this conclusion, you can just go nominal dollars, they actually have levels of GDP per capita that are above the level of GDP per capita of some European Union member states, which are classified as developed one. So essentially, the second block tries to address with what we think is this distortion in terms of the structure of the current membership of the WTO by trying to incentivate countries to what we would call a graduation process. I would like to try to ask Caroline when was the last time that a country in the World Bank actually graduated. We are still giving money to China, as far as I remember, right? A country that gives virtually hundreds of billions of dollars to other countries still receive loans from the WTO, from the World Bank. So just to finish here, we are going to propose mechanisms that effectively will incentivize the graduation of countries so that you don't stay as a developing country forever. As we all know, there is a moment in time in which you should grow up. Another part of what we are going to be proposing is that the new additions to SDTs, so the special treatments under the WTO, are going to be data-based and means-tested. Yeah, if you ask this in some new future treaty, you have to clearly make an analytical defense of why you are requesting for that. Finally, one thing that we are going to be proposing is that in terms of the existing SDTs, we are not questioning the fact that you as a country has this as a treaty based, but there should be some sort of a planned trajectory for you to evolve out of this stage and to become a fully graduated, fully compliant country in the WTO. Now, a final component of reforms on this first block, and I will stop here, I have not addressed the two others, is related to the functioning of the WTO per se. One of the great advantages of the European Commission as a body that represents projects and defends the European interest is that we have right of initiative, which is granted to us by the treaties, which means that we are not a member state driven to a significant degree because the bodies of the Union have a power of initiative per se, which means that once we have member states that sometimes are, well, allegedly uncooperative, we have something from our side that we can try to do. That's not the case of the WTO. The WTO is essentially, for all practical purposes, a member-driven type of organization with fairly limited powers in the Secretariat, and every single time that we have the Secretariat trying to do something in a more comprehensive way, there is a significant wave of backlash from traditional blocs in terms of the WTO. Part of our proposals are respecting the current frameworks to empower the Secretariat of the WTO to have a more proactive role in terms of its relationships with the WTO member states as a more effective way to enforce global rules in an adequate way. A final point about multilateralism. The Union is a staunch defender of multilateralism. This said, we realize a situation that even if multilateralism should be our first default in terms of behavior, there are situations in which arguably groups of countries, pioneers if you like to use this expression, could eventually proceed ahead with levels of liberalization within the framework of the WTO as to block away, to escape away from blockages that the system has locked us in. Part of our proposals is to try to enshrine on the WTO a sort of additional annexes, what we call flexible multilateralism, in which groups of countries could proceed with deeper WTO compliant liberalization, so MFN compatible, as to enable those countries to proceed with global liberalization. So just to indicate to you how we are in terms of process. We have already reached out to the WTO Secretariat 2 days after the publication of our proposals. On the 18th of September we published it, then on the 20th we were in Geneva talking to the WTO. On the 25th, beginning of this week, we were with our counterparts on the trilateral at the margins of the UNGA, the United Nations General Assembly, where we met with the Japanese Minister of Trade and Ambassador Lighthizer, the USTR, and there was a significant agreement between the three parties in terms of how we could proceed towards the WTO reform. We have 2 or 3 initial projects on how this cooperation is going to go forward. We consider this a very fast rollout of our proposals, and the next on the line are major BRIC countries, namely the People's Republic of China, that we would like to bring to the table to this discussion. After all, they are a major stakeholder in terms of the global multilateral trading framework. I look forward to your reactions and to the reactions of the panel.
Thank you very much. Before I open it generally to questions, I have a sort of general question for the panel, which is this. When we talk about the backlash against globalization and try to think of examples, they very frequently seem to be examples from the developed world, and not actually all of the developed world either. The United States, certainly, but then, of course, the Electoral College could have gone the other way. The EU, parts of it, the UK, sorry about that, but the EU continues to sign FTAs, not Japan, not Canada. And I don't really think you see it in a great swathe across the emerging world. Of course, as Caroline pointed out, China continues to use subsidies and sort of economically nationalist and uses interventionism aggressively, but it's not really protectionist, it's still outward looking. So the question is, given that this is a relatively limited phenomenon, why is it that the structures of governance of world trade seem to have seized up? Is it that there are big swathes of the world, particularly the emerging world, that just simply aren't pulling their weight? The anchor of the world trading system, the US, has gone, and no one else really seems to want to come up and replace it. Lúcio?
If you allow me, and of course, please, afterwards. I think that this is a misrepresentation. For anyone that has been following our efforts, and I'm just going to quote two examples here, to strike a deal with Mercosur, which is a trading bloc that involves 4 of the largest economies of South America, knows that there is an underlying very significant component of protectionism in the Federal Republic of Brazil, in previous incarnations of the Federal Republic of Argentina, that has effectively blocked the progress on this area. And you can think of the signing of an FTA between the Union and Mercosur from the point of view of Mercosur as a proxy for global trade liberalization.
Can I just interject one thing? That's hardly new, though. That's been going on. We've actually come closer to signing a Mercosur deal than we have for 20 years. I'm talking about the phenomenon that seems to be regarded as a new phenomenon over the last few years. That's what I'm sort of interested in.
I framed our discussion in terms of effectively a long-term type of discussion, right? So there is this globalization type of shock and technological shock that is actually long-standing. Continuing on the examples that I was going to give, the discussions that we have with the Commonwealth of India are another example of a protectionist stance that you have on major developing economies. As we all know, there was a certain coalition that blocked the Doha Round 20 years ago, and 2 of the countries that I just quoted, the Federal Republic of Brazil and the Commonwealth of India, with China on the back, were the ones that were driving the blockage of the WTO. So I would not see this as something that is restricted to developed countries in general.
Yeah, I would say something that, I think we're at a point of disruption, and it is the industrialized countries that have led the world trade system, and in particular the US. So at this point, the system seems shaky, but I think it could come out stronger if we're able to deal with the issues at stake. And one thing is, if we look back to the mid-'80s, it was a similar time when people were very concerned about stagnating trade. There was, voluntary export restraints imposed on Japan from U.S., voluntary import restraints, or what are they called, import agreements that Japan was taking. And ultimately, it was all these kind of non-tariff barriers started coming up. And then there was a view towards changing it, and we got the Uruguay round, and we got the fastest period of trade growth in a really long time. Trade grew, twice as fast as income from the early 90s to the mid-2000s. But if you read the literature in the late 80s, it's all about how trade is stagnating, what's going to happen, which ism, multilateralism, regionalism is going to work. So I think that it could be the same, and I'm hoping it could be the same this time. And I think we're starting to already see a backlash against the backlash. So, would Japan, EU be moving as quickly in the absence of some of the tensions? Maybe China and RCEP and the Belt and Road Initiative. Then we have agreements throughout Latin America and so forth. So I think there is a sense in which regionalism is still working. On a concerning side, I think that the U.S. move away from the open markets is giving countries that are inherently protectionist space to be more protectionist. So we've seen that with India and Pakistan, where they've been able to raise tariffs that might have gotten a little bit of global attention, but in this environment, it seems okay. I heard recently that, Uganda saying, oh, but, we need these kinds of things. This is the policy that works. And every country starting to have a made-in policy. So I think that's the concern, that we move quickly away. But hopefully it'll be more like a disruption that ends up with stronger rules, and we go back to the kind of trade and growth we've had in the past.
Okay, thanks very much. I think we'll open it up to questions. If you could raise your hand if you have a question, and if you do, please turn your microphone on and give your name and your affiliation. Yep.
Thank you so much. Could I have two questions for different speakers? Two questions for different speakers.
Yes, absolutely. Could you just give your name and your affiliation first?
Sorry, my name is Hector Torres. I'm based in Geneva. I am Senior Fellow of the Center for International Governance Innovation, former WTO staff, and IMF Executive Director. So I have a question for Lúcio. I'm not surprised that there is agreement on the substance of the reforms that have to take place at the WTO, and indeed I read your concept paper, and I find myself in agreement with most of it, if not all. But my question is about process. Do you think the WTO could be reformed from within the WTO? Or do you think we have to have a substitute and then hope that recalcitrant countries would jump in at some point and adhere? And then, brief question for Paola. Are firms lobbying only on lawmakers or also on trade negotiators? Thank you.
So they are lobbying, so what they're lobbying not only congressmen, but also USTR and other federal agencies. What they have to report, any lobbying firm, trade union, industry association, as long as you're trying to influence federal policy making, you have to report. That's the Lobbying Disclosure Act. So what we, in our main data set, I didn't go into the details, we focus on lobbying that occurs in the ratification phase. Because the way we trace lobbying on particular agreements is by looking at the bill numbers in the Senate and the House for the ratification of the agreement. So by looking at those lobbying reports that are specifically linked to bill numbers for the ratification, we are in the main database focusing on lobbying on congressmen, because you are at the end of the negotiation. The only thing you can affect is whether the agreement passes. It has been negotiated, signed by the executive. It's now at the ratification phase, and there when you lobby congressmen. But when we did the extension where we looked at, instead of using bill numbers, we use keywords. And that allows us to go back years during the negotiation phase. Then the lobbying will be USTR and other agencies, not just congressmen. So there's both, basically. And depending on how you search for the lobbying related to the trade agreement, you're going to capture lobbying that goes on at different stages of the negotiation, and different agencies will be involved.
Many thanks. This is effectively the key question on the table. Now, the Union, talking about the European Union as a sort of a benchmark of how flexible you can be as an international organization, or as a multinational organization in our case, we have significant inbuilt advantages because we have the powers that are given to us by the treaties. We have the fact that the member states surrender voluntarily their unanimity in many areas via the QMV, the qualified majority voting procedures, that enable us to have votes in key areas, not with all the member states on board, but just with part. This was only possible because there was a clear political will of certain member states also in designing compensatory mechanisms to those countries that were perceived to be, quote unquote, losers of certain types of discussions. Now, how do we parse this to a institutional framework like that of the WTO, or for that matter, the United Nations? In other terms, organizations in which one country, one vote, and in which you don't actually have QMV types of procedures. Our negotiating approach has followed the notion that we have the capacity to try to create coalitions with significant counterparts in the developing and developing country spectrums that might be used for a breakthrough in some of those areas. But we are not naive. We have been trying this with Doha and has not worked in the past 20 years. Hence our proposal for what we call flexible multilateralism. In other terms, you are always going to have as our first default the multilateral option, but even within the WTO itself, there is a scope for you to have a group of countries that will proceed forward with a deeper level of liberalization or more binding rules. That's what we call the plurilateralism within a WTO framework, which becomes WTO compatible because of the MFN clause that would be attached to it. Now, if you think of this in those terms, this actually is an old idea. Bob Zuelik, actually, back in the 1990s, had something that he called competitive liberalism, in which if you all liberalize, the whole planet is going to be liberalized. It didn't actually exactly work this way, but I mean, yeah. So we have then two potential approaches that we can use and that we are planning to use on this situation. The usage of coalitions of large developing and developing countries, and a proposal to advance as specific blocks of countries is still in a WTO framework, so respecting the system without trying to get out of the system, with groups of countries that will proceed forward, but enabling the process to be still MFM compatible so everybody would be able to benefit from that.
Thank you. And I see a question here.
Thank you, Mr. Chen. I just have a question for Ms. Caroline. And you said there are some problems now. One side is the United States or some advanced countries. Another side is the rise of China. So the rise of China, in fact, the issues is the subsidy, state-owned company, investment, and technology innovation. So I think this is not the problem. The problem is how to evaluate the function of a government in a country's development. If a country just rely on the market, how the government to play for their functions to push forward the development. And also there is a question is how to evaluate the fair competition between the countries. If the country, the government play a very active role, that is fair, and how to make the international norms to regulate the national competition, as well as what the function will WTO can play. Thank you. My name is Long Yue Zhao from the University of Guangdong University of Foreign Studies, China. Thank you.
Should we take one or two more and do them as a bunch if there are any? Sorry.
I'm Stormy Mildner. I work for the Federation of German Industries. I'm also affiliated with the Hertie School of Governance, and before that worked for think tank SWP in Berlin. So my two issues or questions are addressed to Paola and Brigid, and let me come from my own business perspective and maybe share a little bit of my insight on those topics as well. I know that the U.S. market, so to say, is different than the German one with regard to the organization of business interests. But I was wondering if in the model if the model which you developed could also be applicable to other countries, or would find a problem there. Because if I'm looking at small, medium enterprises in my country, they are clearly organized through associations which have a pretty big power and influence on trade issues and lobby on behalf of small and medium enterprises. Another thing is also at home, we saw that throughout the TTIP debate, big companies are often not so keen on on making a public lobbying effort for a trade agreement, but they also let associations do that, so they sometimes hide behind them. So again, there seems to be a bigger influence of associations. I don't know if that can be modeled in your model or not, but I think that's something to consider. It might that your model underestimates the lobbying efforts of small medium enterprises for FTAs if you're looking at the German market, in short. Then my second question is if I understood correctly that you're mainly looking at money, at finances, being as a proxy for how much, okay, then I misunderstood, because I think there are other ways to measure how much you're lobbying as well, like at how many meetings you're participating, on how many panels you're sitting, how many tweets you're sending every day, and so on. And then it might also look a little bit different than just looking at money. With regard to public opinion, I find the current public opinion polls in the United States fascinating, I have to say. Looking at the Pew polls or also the Gallup polls, and how that is changing within a few years and months, and what might really drive public opinion on trade. So Gallup, for example, said it is mostly linked to the economic situation and the employment figures. Then I'm looking at the Pew polls, however, and then I seem to find a clear link for party affiliation and what is coming out of the White House and what is not coming out of the White House, so to say. So what really drives public opinion? Is it the leaders who very much influence what the general public think? Or is it the other way around? Is it the economic situation? What really drives public opinion? And then, Paola, I was thinking that also influences the companies. Are they influenced by the public opinion on trade, and if it's bad, they invest more? If the economic situation is bad, do they invest more? If unemployment is high, do they invest more? Or is it the other way around, that they become more protectionist in bad times instead of in good times? Because the public in general becomes more pro-free trade in good times than in bad times, apparently. So, a whole bundle of questions.
Okay, can we answer those two, and then we'll take one final round of questions, but you go first.
And we can talk over coffee. You had lots of stuff.
Just to say, I think you raise a lot of important questions about sovereignty and what is a government capable of doing, and so forth. And I think that's right, but when domestic policy has negative spillovers for the rest of the world, if that's the case, then it needs to be addressed. And right now, I think it's viewed as the case by some. So maybe we need more analytics to define exactly how much and what type of rules would work. But I'm concerned that if we don't find the type of rules that would work, the system could fall apart. And just to remember that reform is also good. Economic evidence shows that that the growth in China has been, both in jobs and in GDP, has been largely driven by the private sector, and moving more into the private sector and more consumption-led. And I think China's going in that direction, and it's just a matter of the pace in order to satisfy the situation. But certainly these issues of sovereignty are very, very difficult. So I don't think I have a good answer.
So let me try to be brief, and we can talk more later. So we focus on the US, partly because the data, if you want to do political economy or trade, that's where the data is. I've been trying, since I'm based in Brussels, I've been trying for years to get better data about EU trade policy and firms. It's extremely hard. I have students, for example, one student who was on the market this year who did very interesting paper on US anti-dumping. But this is something you can get all the votes in the ITC Commission. You ask, as I've done, to the relevant decision makers in the EU, their votes on anti-dumping, they are not public. So if you want to study votes in Congress, they are all roll call votes. So, or if you want to get firms' information, you can have Compensat. There's no such a thing, you know, or I guess you can use Orbis. I'm starting a few projects now that are related to political economy in the EU, but one of the limits is the data. Lobbying data sets like you have in the US don't exist. About the model, it can be applied to EU. I mean, it's a very broad general model, and it doesn't only capture, unlike the Grossman-Hellman model, money. You know, it's not about campaign contribution, which would be illegal in the EU, so that model wouldn't apply to the EU. This is about influence in general. And in fact, the kind of lobbying expenditure that firms have to report could be, they cannot be bribing. You have, you know, what this money could be is I'm paying for a study that says how good this agreement is, and I'm trying to influence the debate in Congress. I could organize a meeting, a conference like this. It's basically influence mostly. You have to, if there is any expense that goes with organizing anything or paying a study, you have to report it, but it's not the kind of quid pro quo or campaign contribution. This is a different kind of spending that is more informational, which is, I think, is what firms do also in Europe. One thing I wanted to show you, because you asked about industry associations, so let me just show you. There is lobbying by industry association in the US too, but it's peanuts compared to what, let me just go to the very end. I think I had a picture that I didn't show you, but it's interesting. So, okay, in general, this is firms, associations, and trade unions. And if you zoom in, the firms is all blue, they all support. Association, there's a tiny slice which you don't see actually. So if I take out the firms, you see a bit better the others. So actually even firm association, they spend much less than individual firms, but they mostly are in favor. The trade unions are spending even less, but they're always, almost always, with one exception, against. And I have a student working on the role of trade unions and how, so I think, you know, we have the data, I think they're interesting. You know, it would be nice to have similar data for the EU, it's just, you know, it doesn't exist. Again, I tried to get some systematic information on lobbying. You know, in Brussels, there's industry association, there's firms, there's clearly a lot of lobbying going on, but how to capture their role is very, very hard. One thing about opinion polls, I've also been fascinated, and I've written other papers in the past about the role of intensity in preferences. I think something we forget, we are interested in trade policy here, so we think, whenever we think about our opinion shape, say, trade policy, we think about a median voter model, everyone, what are the preferences of people over trade? And then you look, you know, 50% says that, you know, but in reality, in a democracy, you're not making your politicians accountable on one policy issue. You are, you know, politicians know very well that in the end they're going to be re-elected or not on a bundle of policy issues, which means the intensity of preference really matters. So this is why, you know, if you actually look not only at the direction of preferences, but at a few polls that ask intensity, what is striking is that 90% roughly of the people who are interviewed say, I don't care about trade policy. This is not the policy that I'm going to vote my, you know, re-elect or not my representative on. I care about education, taxation. But those, you know, the minority who cares about, who says, you know, this is the policy that is salient to me, they're all protectionist. So there's clearly, you as a politician, as Trump, you know that most people, those who, you know, who are not going to vote for you for what you do on trade policy, you don't need to listen to. The guys you're going to swing, you know, who are going to be relevant when it comes to trade policy are those who care enough about it to vote on them, and these are all protectionists. So a few polls have this information, and I think this is something we should take into account.
Suggestion for a paper, you could use a transparency register which has lists of visits of all quote-unquote registered lobbyists to particular commissioners to use this as a proxy variable
I had a
for...
master's student
Okay. You already have suggestions for 6 dozen different papers, so we don't
I
need...
have no left of those.
The time for coffee is extremely rapidly approaching, but I've seen 2 questions, so I'll take 2 final questions, one here and one here.
Yes, thank you. I'm Martina, I'm a fellow at the UI. My question is about technology, because I think in this backlash against globalization in general, with technology and digital technology has played an important role, it keeps playing an important role, and there's very little has been said in the panel about this. And Ms. Freund has talked about how technology can have an impact on inequality which is stronger than trade, and probably people are like misunderstanding where this impact on inequality is coming from, but isn't actually technology amplifying the speed through which trade amplifying the speed through which technology is diffusing and is having an impact on the labor market, and therefore aren't these two things really strongly interlinked? And the studies that are looking at technology and trade, are the studies considering this important linkage? And if not, can we say that trade really is a force that can counterbalance the negative impact of technology on the job market? That's my question.
Okay, and let me take this final question, and then thank you.
Thank you. My name is Xiankun Lu. I'm from China, Professor. Just one quick question for Lúcio, the last speaker from EU Commission. At the end, you say that on one hand, you have this trilateral group of Japan, US, and EU. On the other hand, recently between EU and China, you have also established a joint group to discuss the WTO reform. I mean, at the end, when you say that you try to bring China to the negotiation discussion table, I mean, what's in your mind, your next steps? I mean, it's going to be 3+1 or a bigger group? How big? Who else other than the four? And if anything miraculously comes out of that, how did you translate that into the WTO rules? I mean, what's between this small group and the larger non-participating members? I mean, just one information, you know that French President Macron has proposed 3+1 summit, and which of course didn't happen. I mean, so there are some nuance there. How do you plan to resolve that? Thanks.
Okay, on the technology and trade question, I think it's a great point. Nobody really knows how much is one and how much is the other. I guess people point to technology because they make the point that value added is increasing as workers are falling. So clearly technology is improving a lot. Part of that is trade though, because you can be specializing in the higher value added stages of production. So you're right that they reinforce. The one point I would make though is that if you look globally, the share of employment that's in manufacturing is actually pretty constant since 1970. So if it was all about trade, one would expect it to be increasing because you're moving manufacturing to countries where it needs more workers per product. If it was all about technology, you'd expect it to be decreasing. I feel like there's some force, so some great theoretician should write a paper on this, about what force is keeping that constant. It's clearly both. Anybody who says they know what percent is either, it can't be right. But I think the general intuition is, and maybe it's wrong, is that it's more technology than trade based on what's happening across countries and within countries.
The two are not unrelated. I mean, technology has allowed fragmentation of production. I mean, without the ITC revolution, firms would have not started offshoring as much. So I think this automation versus trade is also not as clear-cut.
That's actually the point that I was going to make, right? That there is no opposition between the two, right? One has to assume that they, or not, right? I mean, right? So there is a certain complementary and or opposition between the two of them, which is a empirical question, which is likely sector specific. On your question, part of the reason why we have at this stage separate channels of discussion with separate groups of countries, which is that we have pre-existing frameworks for discussions with different groups of countries. We have a high-level economic dialogue with the People's Republic of China. We have a working group on our ongoing discussions for an investment agreement. And we have the trilateral with the Republic of Japan and the United States of America. So the initial stages of discussions naturally used the pre-existing frameworks that we had for negotiations, discussions with our partners. There is going to be a point in the near future in which we hope to have those different strands brought to the table. And this is also linked to the agenda that we have for the next year in terms of the Japanese presidents of the G20. That would be a natural environment for us to have the main stakeholders around the table. We have already started discussing, as our counterparts in the World Bank and the IMF, which are also represented on the discussions, are aware of, how to integrate those discussions for the G20 agenda during the course of next year.
And with that, I think we'll bring the first session of the conference to a close. It's been very varied and very interesting. I'm sure you'd like to join me in thanking the panel for their contributions. Thank you.